if you type the question in chat. Where we left off last week was we noticed that there was a little bit of a problem. Not a huge problem, but something that we probably could handle better, something that we could give the user a better experience with. And that was this scenario here. Now remember, in this case, our validation, part of it is done in the client side and part of it is done on the server side. I deliberately did not validate beats per 6 seconds on the client side because I wanted to leave some of the validation for server side. So if I validate on the client side, would never hit that server side validation code. So I don't validate it on the client side. But I do validate age, right? So if I type in an invalid age, type nothing in for age, click submit, get the client side error. If I type something in for age that's correct and something for beat value that's invalid, I click this, that's going to send it to the server for validation. All right. Now, in our case, we're sending it actually to another page. So we're sending it to another page to do the calculation. So if I click calculate, I go to the check range page and it tells me beats are not a number. Well, if you think about it from a usability perspective, that's not really that good because, first of all, it doesn't show the user what they had typed in. You know, I guess we could display to the user what they typed in, but if they want to go back to the form and correct it, they have to take an action. They either have to click this or hit the back button. All right. And it would be nice if we just kept it up on the screen, the form up on the screen, and showed the user what they had typed in before and let them make the correction right there without them having to go through and either clicking the link again or clicking the back button. The reason of this problem is because we have the form in a separate page than the page that does the processing. So need to click that one. In this case, we have calculator and check range. Go back, we go back to calculator, click it, and the code that does the processing is in check range. All right, so it would be nice if when they clicked it, we got any errors and the result on the same page. Then they could just enter the next one if they wanted to. So it'd be nice if we could do this. We type in their age, we type in an error. We get the server side error saying beat's not a number. Now we'll see that server side error, all right. How do I know it's server side error? Now, I know it's server side error because the URL has changed. The URL has changed, but we're still on the same page, if that makes any sense. When we type this in, when we click submit, boom, we've submitted to this page and we've passed on the URL on the query string, the form values, the text age, the text beats, and BTN submit. So what it boils down to is we have 3 scenarios that we want this calculate postback to handle. And we want it all to happen on the same page. We don't want to go to a second page because then again, they have to click back or click the link again to go back to re-enter the data. The 3 scenarios are, number 1, The user enters valid data and the result should be calculated. Number two, the user enters invalid data and the results can't be calculated, but we get a server-side error. The third scenario is if we're just displaying the form for the first time. So that's the three scenarios that we want to handle. I should put them in a better order. And I'll say the first one is the initial load. The second scenario is user submitted invalid data. And the third scenario is user submitted valid data. So essentially, we have a page that's going to work in three modes. It's going to do three different things. All right. Now, in order for this to work, the page has to know what mode it's in. Is this the initial load of the page? Is this, have we entered in invalid data? Have we entered in valid data? So, how do we know what mode we're in? Well, the initial load is easy. There's nothing on the query string with the initial load. So there's nothing on the query string. That means that we're loading this page for the first time. Therefore, display a blank form and that's it. That's all we do on the initial load is display a blank form. If the user submitted it as invalid data, there's going to be something on the query string. So I go and I type in invalid data. Notice that's the URL when it initially loaded. When we submit to it, we get this as the URL. So there's something on the query string. So, and validation failed. And in my case, there probably is a flag that says be valid. Because that's kind of what I always do, be valid equals false. Now, what do we want to do with this? With this, we want to display the form, but we want the form displayed populated by the submitted values. So notice we display an error, but we've just put back in the form the values that we added initially. Now, this is a form that only contains 2 fields, right? So if they had to retype them, that's not a great tragedy. But if you could imagine you're doing a FAFSA form, which has a financial aid form, which has 1 million fields on it. If you got a server-side error with that and it started with a blank form again, that'd really be a pain for you to do that. So we want to redisplay the form, but we want to display it populated with the values that were submitted. What I'm talking about here, what I'm showing here is sort of a template for any kind of PHP form processing. You know, it's not just, doesn't just apply in this particular case. It could apply for any sort of form that you're doing. So what do we want to do? Redisplay Oh, sorry, I wrote that. Although I'm going to change it to redisplay form populated by submitted values. Now, how do we know if it's valid? What are the conditions by which it's valid? Well, first of all, there's something on the query string. All right, and you notice this and this have that in common. In other words, that's how we're going to tell that the form was submitted, is we're going to look for something on the query string, because that will eliminate the possibility that it's just the initial load. Now, but validation passes in other words, be valid equals true. What do we want to do there? Well, we're still going to redisplay the form data. That's always good to show back the data that you have, the form has been given. That way they can look at it and check to make sure they didn't type in something that may be legal to type in, but not the right value. Like they could, their finger could have slipped and they could have typed in, 32 beats in 10 seconds instead of in 6 seconds rather than 21 beats or something like that. And lastly, we are going to display the results. Now, I forgot to mention one thing. If there's a invalid data, we want to display error messages as well. So this is sort of the flow of how the script is going to work. So let's look at stuff in common. Display a blank form, redisplay form, redisplay form. So in all cases, we're displaying the form again, okay, regardless. The only difference between the two is in the first case where it's initial load, we're displaying a blank form. And in the case of a submitted form, whether it's valid or not, we're displaying it with the old values populating the form. So that's one thing it has in common. If each of these happen, if the form is submitted, we validate the form. We don't validate the form, obviously, if it's the initial load, because the user hasn't even had a chance to enter data yet. So if it's been submitted, we're going to validate the form. And finally, either we're going to display error messages if it's invalid, or we're going to display the results. So the first thing we want to know is, how do we know if the form was submitted or not? Well, I talked about things on the query string. Specifically, I'm going to look, that's what the query string looks like. Specifically, I'm going to look to see if the submit button was pressed. Right? I guess I could pick any of these, but I mean, it sort of makes sense to say, well, was the submit button pressed? Well, that's how I know it was submitted. Now, in the case where you have multiple buttons on a form, where maybe you do different things, it's possible to have multiple submit buttons on a form, right? Because let's say you brought up a piece of data and you could either update it or delete it. You'd have 2 buttons, right? In that case, you would want to look at specific buttons. Was button A pressed or was button B pressed? That's kind of why I look at the button, because that's a safe bet. Always look to see if which button was pressed, if any buttons have been pressed. So we're going to look to see if button submit has a value. What is the value of a submit button? The value of a submit button is the defined in the attribute of the submit button. So if we scroll down here and find the submit button here, the submit button has a value calculate. That's why it says on the query string value calculate. Now, everything I'm saying here applies whether we're doing a get or a post. The reason I use the get in this case is to show you, all right, what's on the query string, to show you how we can use that, what's on the query string, to determine whether it's the first time or if the form has been submitted. All right, so with all those things in mind, where is be valid going to be set? Well, there's going to be a validation function on our client side, on our server side, I mean. So let's start looking at these. So I'm going to open up calculator postback. And what are the other includes? Check range. No, that's not check range. Check range INC. And remember, it's better not to use the INC suffix. And we also have the heart, which I'll open up. I don't know if we need to look at it or not. That's the one nice thing about having things in include files. All right. We've already pretty much proved to ourselves that these functions work, right? So really, I open up that include file, but really we're probably not even going to look at it. All right. Really, we're not going to even look at it, probably. All right, so let's look at the flow here. We have our includes. We have our client-side validation, which again only validates to make sure that something was typed in the text stage. I only did that again just to demonstrate how you can connect client-side validation with something to post to the server. And how do you do that? You have on the form an action, on the action, with the action, you have an onSubmit method that returns the response from validate form. And if it returns a true, it's going to continue with submitting the form. If it returns a false, it's going to stop submitting it. All right. We have two variables here, age and beats. That corresponds to the two elements on the form. All right. We're looking to see if the text age is set. What does that mean? It means, is there a value on the query string for text age? When would there be a value? There'd be a value if the form has been submitted. The initial load of that page, there's not going to be anything on the query string. So therefore, text age is not going to have a value on the query string. And therefore, we're not going to set the variable age to the value from the query string of text age. Same thing with text beats. If there's a value, we set the beats variable. If there's no value on the query string, we do not set the beats variable. Bottom line is here, this point, we have two variables, age and beats. And they either have spaces in them, or I'm sorry, they either have an empty string in them, or they have the value from the query string. they'll have spaces, or keep wanting to say spaces. They'll have an empty string in them if it's the first time the page is loaded. They'll have the value on the query string if the form had been submitted back to itself. So at this point, these two are populated correctly. We then have our form, and notice what we do. Text box for age here. Our text box for beats are here. We give the text box a value. Value equals, that's how you can give a text box a default value. Value equals, and then we pop into PHP just for a second and echo out the age. So we're outputting the age that we've gotten from the query string if it's submitted. Here we're echoing the text beats. So I type in 22 and 11, calculate. If I were to look at the source of this, which is always a good thing to do when you're debugging or when you're looking at figuring out whatever you want to say, server-side code, is look at the HTML source that was generated by the code. And in this case, we have our input for the text box for text age, value equals 22. Well, where did it get 22 from? It got it from the query string. Likewise, where did it get 11 from? It got it from query string. So this accomplishes this, this, and this. So we're displaying the form either way. All right, whether it is first time the page initially loads or whether it's been submitted. So that handles the displaying of the form. All right, cool. So now I'm checking to see if there is a value in the submit button. Well, remember, when we submitted, we get past that value on the query string, whatever the value is defined for the submit button. And we're testing to see if the submit button has a value. Again, because there's only one submit button on this page, we just only care if it has a value, right? If there were, well, never mind, forget that, rewind, forget that. We're checking to see if if that submit button has been pressed. And if it's been pressed, we do the following. We validate the form and get that valid flag. And if the results are valid, we're going to display the output. So we've handled the initial load scenario. Now we're checking to see if the validation is correct. We're checking to see if validation is true or validation is false. So what are we doing there? Where is validate form? I put it in check range include. Now remember, check range include doesn't really need to be an include file because this is code that is directly associated with this page and only this page. Check range does not have any code that we're going to share between pages. I guess we are in this case because we have a non-postback and postback, but in an actual application, you wouldn't have both versions of the form. You'd only have one of them. And in that case, I could have incorporated check range right back into the PHP file. Well, let's see what validate does. validate form. Assumes it's true, and we've seen this function before. It looks at the different conditions. It looks and makes sure that both age and beats are set, that is, that they have a value, and then it makes sure that they are numeric. If they're not set, we set the valid flag to false. If they're not numeric, we set the valid flag to false. And in any case, we output an appropriate error message. Now, if you remember before, I talked about usually we don't want our functions to output directly to the page. This is an exception because this is not an example of code that we want to share between pages. This code is tied directly to this page, all right? And therefore, it's okay if it outputs to the page. So we output the error messages. And we return that B valid flag. Well, if it's not valid, it doesn't do anything. So if the validation failed, yes, we display the error messages. And if the validation passes, we call display output, which does the actual calculation, grabs the values from the text. Again, this doesn't use arguments because this function is tied to this specific page. This is not intended to be a reusable include file. Therefore, it's okay for us to pull things directly from the query string. Now, these functions, on the other hand, are reused, right? They're used both on the chart and they're used in this little calculator. Therefore, I want those to follow all the rules that I defined for good functions from before, that they take everything in as an argument that they need. They return one answer that whoever calls it uses to do whatever they need to do. Okay, so we grab these, grab the values. We call the function in range. And if you remember, the function in range returns a value of -1, 0, or 1. -1 indicates that the heart rate is below the exercise range. 0 indicates that it's within the exercise range, and 1 indicates that it's above the range. So if we get, depending on the value we output the results, which only occurs if form had been submitted and the validation passes. Any questions about this? Those of you online, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. All right, let's summarize what I think was important about this example. First thing I think was important about this example is we broke things down into include files. It's especially important to break things into include files when they're going to be shared between pages. And what's an example of something that's going to be shared between pages? That is what we would call our business rules or our logic, our problem logic, our problem domain logic. Like, for example, how many beats should someone that's 40 years old, what's the range for their exercise heart rate? That's a business rule. All right. That should not be built within the interface. There should be a separation of those business rules from the user interface. So we did that. We did that by creating this hard include, and we put everything we needed to do that calculation in here. And these functions were written to be reusable. That is, they took arguments. They don't refer to anything on the page inside their body, and they return a result. So for your assignment, you might do the calculation correct. View what the assignment is. Lab 9, you're going to create a tuition calendar calculator. And for Lab 10, you're going to create a tuition chart. Now, here's the thing. The rules, the calculation that you put in that does this, the function that you put in that does this calculation, it should be the same function used by both of those pages. Don't have a different calculation. Don't have a function that's part of this page and a separate function that's part of this page. I'm thinking of what got deductions in the past. And that's a big thing that's going to get deductions. If you've repeated the programming logic, the business logic in the calculator as well as in the chart, then you're going to get points off, even if it calculates correctly. All right. Because you got a correct answer. That's good, but you've written code that becomes difficult to maintain. If there's a change to the tuition rates or whatever, you need to change it in multiple places. And that's never good because you're going to forget one of them one time. All right. Or you're going to, make an error and type in something else. So you're going to copy and paste when it's not appropriate to copy and paste or something like that. Something is going to go wrong eventually if you take the approach of having duplicate code. If, however, all the code is in one function, then if it's wrong everywhere. And that's bad news, all right? But the good news is there's only one place to fix it if it's all in one place. Let's spend a minute looking at the actual tuition chart. Now, if you look at this, it looks like for in-county, if you're in county, that you get charged $159.03 for each credit hour. That's only true up to a certain point of the chart. For here, yes, that's one. This is 2 times 159.03, 3 times, 4 times. When you get up to 13 though, 13 is still 13 times that rate, but they give a deal, 14 through 18 credit hours all get charged the same thing. All right. So your code's going to have if statements in there to see what range are the credit hours. If it's less than 13, then you simply do a multiplication of the rate times the number of credit hours. If it's between 13 and 18, you simply have 13 times the rate. Now, the one that a lot of people miss is that 19 and above, you actually get charged the 13 amount plus for every credit hour above 18, you get charged at the rate. So in other words, 19 credit hours. To calculate that, that's the 13 credit hour cost plus 1 times the rate. That would be the calculation for it. All right. So you can start getting charged again at 19, but you don't simply multiply 19 times the rate. You multiply how many over 18 it is times the rate and add that to the amount for 13 through 18. So that's the second cause of problems, is people don't get this correct. And it's the same, by the way, for out-of-county resident and out-of-state resident. It's just that the rate is different. Remember, your job is to write code that that's reusable and that's easy to maintain. Now, I've had students, and I'm not picking on them, all right, because if you don't know a better way to do it, at least they got it to work, that will have a statement that will have like a series of 18 or 21 if statements. If credit hours is equal to 1, then tuition is $159.03. If credit hours is equal to 2, then it's $318.06, and so on down the line. All right. That's may give you the right answer, but that's not easy to maintain, because if they change the credit hour rate to, let's say, $165, they have to change it in every if statements that they have. And that's not good. If instead you figure a formula that will work in all cases, then all you have to do is change the rate if they change the rate. So you want to minimize the changes that are required. I guess the other point of this exercise is the importance of include files. Now, again, here's a disclaimer I've given. It's best to name your include files with a .php extension as opposed to INC. It's more secure. So forgive me for using INC in these cases. But we use any code that we want to repeat on pages. We put in an include file, and that can be HTML or that can be HTML and PHP. Literally, you can put anything in an include file that you can put in a PHP page. So you could put JavaScript in an include file. You could put CSS code in an include file. So literally, you can put anything into an include file. But the whole idea of it is include files are for reusability. All right, so all your pages should have a common look. They should have a header, they should have a footer, they should have a navigation. Those are going to be styled the same. Those are going to look the same. You're not going to have a different navigation on one of your pages than the others. Therefore, those should all be in include files. Now, just to give a preview of next week. Next week is exciting. At least it's exciting for me. Because next week, we're actually getting into one of the big reasons for server-side scripting, and that is to process the databases. Now, I wish I could do more in this class, but I don't believe CISS232 is a prerequisite for this class, which means we can't go too heavy on the database stuff. But we can touch on it and give you an idea and have you work through one exercise and that kind of gives you an idea of how you would do other things as well, how to connect a PHP code with a database. And that's going to require you to do a couple of installs. So you'll need to install two things, MySQL and MySQL Workbench. XAMPP comes with MySQL. All right. If you need to install MySQL, there are many instructions available online. MySQL Workbench is sort of a control panel, if you want to, I don't know if control panel is the right word or not, but it allows you to get in and create databases and add tables and add data and so on. I will be previewing this for you next week. I'll go over it in class. If, however, you have some extra time and the weather outside is rainy and you can't go outside and frolic or anything, then think of installing those MySQL and MySQL Workbench prior to that. And again, review these videos, figure out how to install it. This is enabled. Week 12 is enabled. So therefore, you can start working on this whenever you want to. All right, are there any questions? Any questions out in WebEx land? All right, that's all the stuff I had for today. We will either see you in lab or we will see you next week.